Empower your business or digital agency with Bluehost, trusted by over 5 million WordPress users globally. Bluehost features top-to-bottom hosting optimizations designed specifically for WordPress, giving you 24/7 access to a team of experts for support, plus thousands of WordPress help articles. So if you want to streamline WordPress website creation with intuitive controls and premium support, choose Bluehost, powering over 2 million websites worldwide.
Today on CityCast Madison. Elections urge us to take stock of our lives, including our expenses. One cost that's been on the rise in Madison is, of course, housing. Dane County continues to be the fastest growing county in the state, so demand is up and supply is down. One solution you might not have thought of: churches. Fewer people are attending church, and more churches are considering selling, closing, or reforming their model just to stay open. Reverend Mark Elston, the outgoing executive director at Pres House Campus Ministry, is the author of a book on the topic, Gone for Good: Negotiating the Coming Wave of Church Property Transition. We're bringing back our conversation with him from the spring, where we discuss this catalytic moment for churches and what it might mean for Madison's housing market and third spaces. It's Wednesday, October 23rd. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Reverend Elston, hello.
Hi there.
So you've said that 20 years from now, it's expected we'll lose 1/3 of our churches, and that keeps you up at night. I can only imagine. Tell us why specifically you're losing sleep.
Obviously, I'm a pastor, so I care about the church as a spiritual community, and I say that broadly, the church. This is also happening with other faith traditions as well as Christian churches. But in addition to being spiritual communities, church communities provide so much for their neighborhoods that I think we often don't think about. So Girl Scout troop meetings and AA meetings and neighborhood association meetings, small food pantries for people to pick up a little bit of food when, bills are getting tight. And in our community in Madison, voting. Where are we going to vote when all these churches are something else?
Yes.
So, there's a lot basically at stake with regard to our communities that is beyond even just the kind of spiritual life that goes on in churches, but there's just the community aspect of it.
And, I saw a figure that it was around 100,000 churches are expected to close. What's behind the decline?
I think really it's a shift in the way people are engaging in spiritual activity. So the participation in traditional church activities peaked in the late 1950s and early 1960s when people went to services on Sunday and other services with regularity and in large numbers, and they're just not going the way they used to. I personally don't believe that people are no longer interested in spiritual matters. I think they are still, and I think they're still interested in connecting with people around things that have meaning and around being involved in activities that have purpose and contribute to their neighborhoods. They're just doing it very differently. And so I liken a little bit to sort of the phenomenon that happened when Netflix came onto the scene and Blockbuster video stores started closing very quickly, right? Because it wasn't that people stopped watching movies or didn't want that experience of watching a movie. It's just that they did it differently. And so we're in a moment of massive social change with regard to participation in religious activity, and at a scale that we haven't seen in many generations. And therefore, the properties, buildings, land that was associated with the activities of the past have to change and either close or, in many cases, repurpose and become something a little bit different than they were before.
Yeah. And so for a city like Madison, do you have any sense of how many churches might we expect to see closing right here?
So I would expand the term slightly from closing, because I think a lot of them will actually redevelop. And so many of them may not close completely, but they might reshape the way they look, right? So they might become a church that's housed in a community center and that has affordable housing as a part of their development on their property, or they might just change the way they use their building, right? So they might not all close, although some will eventually as well. So there'll be consolidation. I don't know what the numbers are going to be in Madison. I'm guessing it'll be similar in that range of a third. There's actually a story came out just yesterday. A Catholic diocese, I think in the Baltimore area, is actually closing 2/3 of all of its churches in that diocese. I hope it's not that number
Right,
here,
that's
but it's
dramatic.
going to be quite a few. And it's not going to be just one here and one there. It's going to be 40 out of 100 or some number that is fairly significant, which will have a real impact on our city.
And at a moment of change like this, innovation is kind of the only answer to survive. And it sounds like people are thinking about shifting and changing how they use the space. I know many churches during the pandemic started offering virtual sermons. Can the churches that do end up losing their space still be successful without buildings, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's always been this tension between what is the church? Is it the people or is it the building? And, there's sort of little jokes about that. But they've often been very intertwined. And in some ways, they're actually becoming a little bit more separated now, right? So there are church communities that don't have buildings, and then there are buildings that were churches that don't actually have churches in them anymore, if that makes sense, right? So you kind of have this separation between the real estate and the community that is the congregation. And that's okay, I think. That's not a terrible thing. And like you said, innovation leads to all sorts of different forms of what that can look like. Sometimes it looks like a lot more going online, and sometimes it looks like a building and property being used really differently, but still perhaps for the sorts of activities that faith communities are committed to or interested in seeing happen.
You've got this incredible book, really cleverly titled, called Gone for Good. And it's about this moment that the church is having that I think anyone, at first glance could describe it as a crisis when you hear those numbers. And then there's this bleak thought for some churchgoers, maybe, oh my goodness, are we going to lose our churches? Are they going to be gone for good? And your spin, to steal your thunder, because I enjoy the title so much, I apologize. Will they be gone for good? Meaning, will they be used for good? And you know what? You did that with Press House on campus. I didn't know this, but Press House is this incredible success story.
Yeah, we did. We had the fortunate opportunity to redevelop our parking lot. It actually was a dream from 1927, way back when Press House was really early, before even the current Press House chapel building existed. There was a dream to put essentially a church building and then student housing, student dorms on this site. But as they got underway building the Press House, the old Press House, you might say, the building, the Gothic building that you see from the terrace when you're looking across the mall, the Great Depression hit in 1931 and they ran out of money. And so they didn't actually ever get to the housing. And then 80 years later, we finally got back around to that idea. The idea had been sort of circulated on and off for generations, and then we got it back around to it in 2007 and opened the Press House Apartments. And yeah, it's exactly what I'm describing in that we serve more students through our Press House apartment community than we do through our Sunday services. We do have Sunday services for students, and they are vibrant and well attended, but we actually serve more students in our apartment community through that program. And that includes housing for students in addiction recovery, sober living. It includes housing for students that are exploring gender and sexuality identity. It includes housing for students that are looking for ways to get connected through sort of community service in the Madison area. So all of those kinds of programs happen in the apartment building. And yeah, essentially we've taken underutilized church-owned land and turned it into what I think is a really beautiful asset on the campus and in the city.
Was it kind of at a moment too where you needed funds, that you needed revenue to be generated? Otherwise, maybe you would face closure as well.
Yeah, it was at a moment that's very similar to many of the churches that are wondering if they're going to be gone for good, and that they, we had very low participation, actually zero at the time when my wife, Erica, who's the pastor, and I came here 20 years ago. And the building was in serious need of repair. The roof was leaking. I was fixing the toilet with paper clips. And it had a lot of, years of deferred maintenance, which is very common. A lot of churches are in that situation where they have older buildings and they have not been able to keep up with the maintenance. So low participation, really severe needs of maintenance and fixing the building, and then funding. And so all three of those kind of happened at that moment in the early 2000s. And this was a way of addressing all of those things and re-engaging in new forms of what we call mission and ministry, new forms of programming with students, while also finding a revenue model that worked, that made it viable and financially sustainable going forward. So yeah, that's exactly what happened here.
Yeah. And using the space to provide housing for students in need. And I understand that y'all generate revenue for scholarships, that almost over $1 million in scholarships has come from this. So we had to use that as an example or talk, in terms of this trend. And here in Madison, we're seeing a number of churches looking to sell their buildings to make way for housing. And that's something Madison desperately needs. I can think of Zion Evangelical Lutheran on the east side over by the Barrymore Theater. Of course, St. John's Lutheran on East Wash, downtown, the proposed $35 million development or redevelopment there. And then I think Northside Christian Assembly on Northport was also hoping to sell. And so do you think it's not just a spiritual service, turning some churches into housing, but a public service that, churches could actually help solve the city's housing crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a range, right? So the projects you described actually are all great examples, and they're all a different range. So in the Zion case, that property was sold, and then the church federated and moved into a different building and over in the Eastmoreland area. So they still exist, but they sold that property, and then they're actually looking at doing something interesting with the other building that their joint church now is in. And that was becoming essentially purely housing. It's going to be one of the greenest buildings Madison's ever built, and multifamily buildings. And so that's sort of the church goes away and the housing comes there in its place, which is a good community need. And as you said, we absolutely need housing really of every kind, and definitely affordable housing in Madison. And then the other examples you describe are where the churches are intending to stay on that site in some form or another, but redo the configuration of their property and add essentially to it at a big scale, especially the downtown St. John's one. And yeah, it's a great way to put a real community need on this property in an amazing infill location. And we've got a lot of those opportunities around the city where you've got church sites that are in really wonderful infill locations on bus lines or walkable or whatever you might say. And we need housing. Where else are we going to put it? So there's a way, it certainly shouldn't fall on the shoulders of all churches to solve our housing crisis. That's a problem that we need to tackle from a lot of different angles. But churches can absolutely be contributors to addressing that issue.
Yeah. And it seems like St. John's congregation, they're viewing their project as an expansion of the church's mission, not a shrinking. What's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly what I'm describing. And so, in these situations where the church intends to stay, they have changed their mission a bit, but expanded it is a good way of putting it, right? And I mean, they've been committed for generations to the good of their neighborhood and to the good of the city. And this is just a different version of that, right? This is an opportunity to do that by housing people. Similar to what we did at Press House, and what they're doing there is a great example of that.
Empower your business or digital agency with Bluehost, trusted by over 5 million WordPress users globally. Bluehost features top-to-bottom hosting optimizations designed specifically for WordPress, giving you 24/7 access to a team of experts for support, plus thousands of WordPress help articles. So if you want to streamline WordPress website creation with intuitive controls and premium support, choose Bluehost, powering over 2 million websites worldwide.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. With Cybersecurity Awareness Month winding down, LifeLock wants to remind you to update your software. These updates will patch up security issues that identity thieves can exploit to gain access to your personal info. For comprehensive identity theft protection, there's LifeLock. LifeLock alerts you to more uses of your personal info and fixes issues that arise. Protect your identity today with a 30-day free trial at lifelock.com/podcast.
I did want to ask, what arguments exist for why churches shouldn't sell their buildings?
Well, I think again, there's this bit of a distinction between selling and kind of redeveloping. And so sometimes they don't have to necessarily sell them. They could lease land, find or do partnerships with developers for part of the property or whatnot. And so they don't necessarily have to completely sell them. I do think there's a risk to selling and just leaving, because then that's it. Like once that happens one time. And then that land that was at least ostensibly community oriented, right? Oriented towards the good of the community in some form or another, at least, is now privately owned, potentially. So there's that risk. Now, there's some creative things. People are looking at partnering with the Community Land Trust, for example, the Madison Area Community Land Trust. And one of the models I'd love to see happen more is church land be donated or sold, at low cost to the land trust. And then it basically remains a community-owned asset at that point. And, permanently affordable housing can be built on it. My worry is that we just sell things for the top dollar and then it becomes just privately owned kind of wealth creation for somebody. And that doesn't really, in my mind, contribute to the good of the neighborhood in the long run. A few of those is fine, but if that happens with tons of them, that's going to be a bit of a shame. And, ironically, we could find ourselves 20 years from now saying, goodness, we need to build some community centers so that we can have food pantries and the places for the Girl Scouts to meet and places to vote. Yeah. And they think, well, actually, we had all that. That was churches.
Right.
Why did we let those all go?
Right.
Why did we just let those all sell off into something else? And now we're trying to figure out how to solve a problem that was already sort of solved, and we've got a new one. So there's that element of it, I guess, that's a bit of a risk.
I know. That's certainly where I went to Girl Scouts.
Yes, exactly.
And voted, the whole, that's where I vote. I vote in a church. How do you see folks getting their social needs met outside of the church if there are fewer spaces?
Yeah, I think that is a concern. There's some really interesting writing around social infrastructure that people have done. I referenced that in my book a little bit. But we don't have lots of places anymore that are free, especially, right? So, there's kind of this idea of coffee shops and Starbucks third spaces and so on, but you still have to pay to go into those places. You have to buy something. Libraries is about it, right? I mean, where else is there that you could potentially go meet people that are quite different from you, potentially have these community activities, some of which may be religious in nature, many of which are not. And where are those spaces? There's just not many of them, right? And we need them more than ever in this moment when so much of our life is mediated through technology.
Loneliness is, huge.
Yes, exactly. Loneliness is huge. And how do we connect? Especially we live in a place where the winter is long. You're not like out on the street for hours, usually in the middle of winter. We need indoor spaces where things can happen and that are not all about money and all about commerce, but that are about community. And that is something that churches have done for a very long time. And so I'm most interested in the sorts of kind of repurposing that still does a version of that. So it may not be that there's a traditional worshiping community there that like there used to be, but can we retain some of that element of some of that still community oriented activity in those spaces and in those properties, or at least some of them? Let's not let them all disappear.
When I was in college, I don't really affiliate with a church anymore. I grew up going to church, but there's this place called The Crossing that had all kinds of community events. They held meditations that Richard Davidson, at the neuroscientist that studies well-being, held. And it was like community discussions around interfaith discussions on topics of the moment. And I also went to Slow Food in the basement. So there's just all of these things. Man, it is so huge to have those spaces. I do, want to get to one thought, which is we know that churches can be powerful and meaningful forces of good. Also, both of us know that not everyone has felt welcome at church. Some folks are made, depending on, what the church is, to feel shame for who they love, maybe not supported in decisions they make about their bodies or when to start a family. Some just have experienced straightforward harm.
Yep.
I gotta wonder how much of what we're seeing, like this exodus, might have to do with people voting with their feet.
I'm not a research sociologist in that particular vein, but absolutely, I believe that is happening. And it's sad. I mean, a lot of the ministry we do at Press House is essentially support for folks who have had harm in other church settings in the past. And it's really unfortunate. And if that goes away, I'm okay with that part of it going away. I mean, harming in the name of faith is, in my view, not real expression of faith. And so that's okay. So maybe there is, but I do think there's a bit of a confusion sometimes, or it gets muddled. And sometimes in Madison, this is played up even more than other places because of our sort of progressive approach to everything. But there's this idea that all Christian organizations or churches are harming people, or all of them are, there's nothing left there any good, kind of an idea, right? And sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I hope that doesn't happen, because I don't believe that's the case. I believe there are a lot of organizations, church organizations, that are really doing wonderful work and that are fully welcoming, fully inclusive, fully supportive of people's choices, who they are, their identities, who God made them to be. And so, I hope we can see more of that happen and less harm. I mean, in the Crossing's an example. We partner with them sometimes. They do lots of good stuff as well. And there's many others that are like that.
Before we let you go, is there anything else you're keeping an eye on right now in the Madison landscape, church building landscape and congregation shifting and changing?
I mean, I guess I get contacted by churches in the area. I'm happy to talk to churches about their own particular stories and have resources that can help them determine what they might want to do with their property. So I'm also quite interested in the conversations that are happening at the city level, sort of city planning level, with regard to zoning for church properties. Can that help? I think that between zoning and potentially funding for affordable housing and even just some other support from the city, I think the city can contribute to good things coming on these properties, or can just sort of wait and see. And I think I'd rather us be a little more proactive, and there has been some of that going on. But that might be my sort of one message I would leave with regard to our city. And as a resident for 20 years of the city, I care a great deal about it. That I think we can make choices and incentivize good things coming when these churches are gone, not just whatever, and let it just kind of happen haphazardly. And I think we're about to tip over from a moment when a church here, a church there changed. Now we're going to see a lot of churches changing. And that's really where we need to be pretty intentional and I think proactive, and helping those churches transition, redevelop or sell and do something else in ways that leave us with good in the neighborhood and not just some random thing.
Well, Reverend, we appreciate you joining us so much. This has been fascinating and illuminating, and more power to you and everyone else, in this moment.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
That's Reverend Mark Elston, local minister and outgoing executive director at Pres House and Pres House Apartments on the UW-Madison campus. He served as executive director there since 2004. He's the author of Gone for Good, Negotiating the Coming Wave of Church Property Transition. If you want to learn more about his book, head to our show notes for a link. That's all for today, here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with a renter in Madison? Or if you know a landlord. Hey, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take very good care.